Daniel pushed open the glass door of the hospital, feeling the cool Denver evening air hit his face. The long day in the operating room had exhausted him. 2 consultations, 1 emergency operation, and endless conversations with patients who looked at him with hope, as if he could give them life back with one move of a scalpel. He was 38, but in the mirror he sometimes noticed the first gray hairs in his dark hair, traces of stress, which he tried not to show. Dan straightened the collar of his coat, glanced at the Rocky Mountains illuminated by the pink sunset, and headed towards his gray SUV parked in the parking lot. Waiting for him at home was Laura, his wife, his anchor in this chaotic world. Their 2-story mansion in the suburbs of Denver, with panoramic windows and a neat garden, was a place where Dan could exhale. He turned the key in the lock, and the aroma of roasted chicken with rosemary immediately hit his nose. Laura was in the kitchen, her silhouette flashing behind the counter as she chopped vegetables. "Dan, are you home?" Laura turned around, wiping her hands on her apron with a small flower. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she had a smile on her face that always made Dan's chest feel warm. "I thought you were going to be stuck in the hospital until midnight again." "Almost," he grinned, taking off his coat and hanging it on a hook by the door. "But I promised you dinner, so I escaped the paperwork." "What it smells like? What do we have?" "Your favorite herb chicken and mashed potatoes." "Sit down, I'm almost finished." Laura nodded towards the bar stool at the kitchen island. "How was your day? Saved a couple more hearts?" Dan sat up, rubbing his neck. "I definitely saved one thing. Man, 52 years old, heart attack. We barely made it to the operating room. But we made it in time. The bypass went smoothly." He paused, watching Laura deftly wield the knife. "And you? How was your charity evening?" Laura sighed, putting the knife down and turning to him. "Oh, Dan, this is some kind of circus. Half the sponsors want their names on all the banners, and the other half complain that we don't raise enough. But I almost reached an agreement with Mike. He promised to help with financing." "Mike, as always, is our savior," Dan joked, opening a bottle of red wine that Laura had left on the table. "What would we do without him?" Mike Stanton had been a close friend of theirs since college. Tall, charismatic, with a touch of gray at the temples and an unfailing confidence in every gesture, Mike built a chain of fitness centers that became popular throughout Colorado. He often helped Laura with her charitable projects, be it money or connections. Dan appreciated his generosity and the fact that Mike always knew how to lighten the mood with a joke. "Well, he's not exactly a savior," Laura laughed, placing a plate of steaming chicken in front of Dan. "But his check for $10,000 for the orphanage definitely won't hurt." $10,000. Seriously, Dan whistled, pouring wine into glasses. "Remind me to thank him next time." "I already reminded you," Laura winked, sitting down opposite. "By the way, he invited us to a barbecue on Saturday. He says he wants to do something informal, just us, him, and a couple of his friends. Shall we go?" Dan thought about it as he cut off a piece of chicken. "It sounds tempting, but I have duty until lunch on Saturday. If I have time, then yes, I'm for it." "You're always busy," Laura pouted slightly, but her tone was more playful than offended. "Sometimes it seems to me that you are married to your operating room and not to me." "Hey, that's not fair," Dan smiled, reaching across the table and squeezing her palm. "The operating room doesn't prepare this kind of chicken for me." Laura laughed, and the tension, if there was any, melted. They continued their dinner, chatting about small things. Dan's new patient who insisted he could eat burgers after the stent, how Laura talked a local artist into donating a painting for the auction, vacation plans. Dan suggested going to Aspen to go skiing, but Laura shook her head. "Aspen is great, but I would prefer something warmer. Maybe California, Santa Barbara." She took a sip of wine, looking at him over the glass. "Santa Barbara." Dan raised an eyebrow. "It's almost 10 hours by car." "But there's an ocean, sun, and no pagers from the hospital," Laura retorted. "Think about it, Dr. Harper." "Okay, I'll think about it." He raised his hands in a playful gesture of surrender. But if I drown in this ocean of yours, you will have to explain to my patients why their cardiologist disappeared." They laughed, and Dan felt the weariness of the day subside. Laura always knew how to pull him out of work stress and bring him back to the moment. Their marriage, 12 years together, was built on such evenings, simple, warm, full of trust. They didn't have children. Laura once said that her charity and his patients were their family, but that suited them. Or at least Dan thought he was. After dinner, they were clearing the table when Laura suddenly stopped, looking at him. "Dan, you're happy, aren't you?" Her voice was soft, but there was a note in it that he didn't immediately catch. "Of course," he looked at her, frowning slightly. "And you?" "Yes," she smiled, but the smile came out a little forced. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if we're doing everything right." "What do you mean?" Dan put the plate in the dishwasher and turned to her. Laura shrugged, looking away. "Don't know. It's just, life goes so fast. You are in the hospital, I am with these funds. Sometimes you want to stop and breathe." "Then let's take a vacation," he suggested, coming closer. "Seriously. Santa Barbara, Aspen, to the ends of the earth. Just tell me." She nodded, but her gaze was still somewhere far away. "Fine. Let's think about it." Dan hugged her, feeling the warmth of her body, and decided that it was just fatigue. Laura was always emotional, especially when her projects took too much energy. He kissed the top of her head and said, "Go to bed, I'll finish here. You have an early meeting tomorrow, right?" "Yes, with the advice of the foundation." Laura yawned, stretching. "Thank you, Dan. You are the best." She went upstairs, and Dan stayed behind to wash the dishes, looking out the window at the dark garden. The Rocky Mountains were barely visible in the night, their silhouettes merging with the sky. Something about Laura's words stuck in his head, but he shrugged it off. "I'm tired," he thought. "Tomorrow will be better." The next day, Dan woke up early to make his morning rounds. Laura was still sleeping, and he left her a note in the kitchen. "Gone to save hearts. I love you, Dee." A busy schedule awaited him at the hospital. Consultations, discussions with colleagues about the new treatment protocol, and preparations for tomorrow's surgery. At lunchtime, he received a message from Laura. "Thanks for the note. Good luck with the patients. I'll see you tonight. I'm in Mike's office discussing the auction." Dan smiled as he typed his answer. "Okay, keep him on his toes. Until the evening." Mike, as always, was at the center of their plans. His office in downtown Denver, with views of skyscrapers and his company's logo Peak Pulse Fitness on the glass doors, was where Laura often held meetings. Dan remembered how the three of them celebrated the opening of Mike's first fitness center 10 years ago. Champagne, laughter, toasts to success. Then Mike was just an ambitious guy with a dream, and now he is a businessman whose name appeared in local magazines. That evening, Dan returned home later than planned. Laura was sitting in the living room with her laptop, looking through some spreadsheets. "Hello, hero," she looked up, smiling. "How is the day?" "Survived." Dan plopped down on the sofa next to her. "And you? How was your meeting with Mike?" "Okay," Laura shrugged, closing her laptop. "He agreed to double his contribution if we added his company as a sponsor of the auction. But honestly, he's so pushy sometimes." "Assertive?" Dan raised an eyebrow. "It's Mike. He's always like this." "Yes, I guess," Laura laughed, but her laughter seemed a little less sincere to Dan than usual. "He just wants everything to be according to his rules." "If he's overreacting, tell me. I'll talk to him," Dan said half-jokingly, although deep down he felt a slight pang of anxiety. "No need, I can handle it." Laura patted him on the shoulder. "Better tell me how your patient is doing with burgers." Dan began to talk, and the conversation smoothly flowed into the usual chatter. They laughed, remembering how they once tried to make pizza at home and almost burned down the kitchen. But somewhere in the depths of Dan's consciousness, there was a feeling that Laura was not telling her something. Her smile was the same, but her eyes. There was something flashing in them that he couldn't make out. By the end of the week, Dan and Laura finally decided to go to Mike's barbecue. His home, a modern mansion with a huge backyard, was full of guests, business partners, friends, a couple of local celebrities. Mike met them at the entrance, smiling widely. "Dan, Laura, glad to see you." He hugged Dan, slapped him on the back, and kissed Laura on the cheek. "Come on in, the meat is already on the grill." "Mike, you've outdone yourself." Laura looked around the yard, where the lanterns were burning and the tables were laden with food. "Is this all of Denver here?" "Almost," Mike winked. "You have to maintain your reputation." "Dan, beer?" "I won't refuse." Dan took the bottle that Mike held out. The evening was fun, music, laughter, the smell of fried meat. Dan chatted with Mike's friends, discussing everything from football to new medical technologies. Laura, as always, was in the spotlight, talking about her next project raising funds for an orphanage. Mike kept coming up to her, pouring wine or joking. Dan watched them, but did not notice anything suspicious. They were the same as always. Laura charming and lively, Mike loud and charismatic. "You're lucky, Dan," said one of the guests, nodding at Laura. "Such a wife is rare." "I know," Dan answered, feeling warmth in his chest. "I was lucky." But when he looked at Laura standing next to Mike, their gazes crossed for a little longer than necessary. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but Dan felt a pang in his chest. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to fatigue. "More beer?" Mike walked up to him, holding 2 bottles. "Come on." Dan took one, trying to smile. "Thanks for the evening, old man. I haven't relaxed this much for a long time." "You're welcome." Mike patted him on the shoulder. "We're a team, aren't we?" "True," Dan nodded, but for some reason the word team hurt his ears. When she and Laura returned home, she looked happy, humming something under her breath. Dan hugged her before bed, inhaling the familiar smell of her shampoo. Everything was as usual, but deep down he felt that something was wrong. It was a vague, almost instinctive feeling that he could not yet explain. "Good night, Laura," he whispered when they lay down. "Calm," she answered, clinging to him. Daniel walked down the hospital corridor, sterile white, smelling of antiseptic and coffee from the machine. His shift had just ended, and he was dreaming of a hot shower and a mug of tea at home. The morning round was busy, discussing a new patient with an arrhythmia with colleagues, checking tests for tomorrow's surgery, and consulting with an elderly woman who insisted on calling him nice doctor. Dan smiled, remembering her words, and adjusted his watch strap. The Rocky Mountains outside the hospital windows were already shrouded in evening shadows, and the sky above Denver turned a deep blue. He had almost reached the elevator when he heard quick footsteps behind him. "Dan, wait." The voice belonged to Caroline Wilson, a nurse on his operating team. Dan turned around. Caroline, a short woman of about 40 with short brown hair and always a serious look, hurriedly caught up with him. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled after a long shift, but her eyes sparkled with determination. "Caroline, did something happen?" Dan stopped, frowning slightly. Usually, she did not run after him through the corridors, preferring to discuss work issues in the staff room. "Yes, but—" She hesitated, looking around as if checking to see if there were strangers nearby. "This is not about work. Can we talk? Somewhere quieter?" Dan felt a slight pang of anxiety. Caroline was straightforward, not one to beat around the bush, and her tone hinted at something serious. "Certainly. Shall we go to the cafe across the street? I was just about to get coffee." "Great," she nodded, but her face remained tense. They left the hospital, crossed the parking lot, and entered the small cafe Mountain Brew, popular among the medical staff. Inside, there was the smell of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon, and behind the counter, the barista was humming something to the radio. Dan ordered espresso, Caroline ordered herbal tea. They sat at a table by the window, away from other customers. "So, what happened?" Dan took a sip of coffee, looking at her. "You look like you're about to tell me I forgot a patient on the operating table." Caroline smiled faintly, but then became serious. She clutched the cup with both hands, as if gathering courage. "Dan, I don't know how to say this without sounding weird, but I saw your wife yesterday. Laura." "Laura?" Dan raised an eyebrow, feeling something skip a beat inside. Where? In a restaurant. The copper pot, the one in the center. I was there with a friend, and Caroline paused, searching for words. She was with Mike Stanton. Dan relaxed, leaning back in his chair. Well, that's normal. They often meet on the affairs of her foundation. Mike sponsors her projects. Dan, Caroline lowered her voice, leaning closer. They didn't look like business partners. They held hands, and honestly, it felt like a date. Her words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Dan froze, his fingers clutching the cardboard cup of coffee. He wanted to laugh, to brush it off, but something in Caroline's serious gaze made him swallow the joke. Are you sure? His voice was calm, but anxiety was already beginning to boil inside. Maybe it was your imagination. Lights in the restaurant, wine, everything. Dan, I'm not blind. Caroline looked him straight in the eyes. They were sitting at a table in the corner, and I saw him take her hand. And then they kissed. Not in a friendly way, you know. Dan felt the blood rush to his temples, and the heart, which he was so good at saving from others, began to beat faster. He put the glass on the table, afraid that he would crush it in his hand. Caroline, this. He shook his head, trying to collect his thoughts. This is some kind of mistake. Laura and Mike are friends. We've been with him since college, damn it. He wouldn't. She wouldn't. I know it sounds crazy, Caroline said softly, and I thought for a long time whether to tell you or not. But you deserve to know. I wish someone had told me when my ex. Well, you know. Dan was silent, looking out the window. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk, cars honked at intersections, and the Rocky Mountains in the distance seemed cold and indifferent. He remembered last night. Laura returned late and said that she was at a meeting with the foundation board. She looked tired, but smiled as usual. Or not quite as usual. Thank you for telling me, he finally squeezed out, trying to keep his voice even. But I'm sure there's a misunderstanding. Laura, she's not like that. Caroline nodded, but there was sympathy in her eyes. Maybe so. Just pay attention, okay? If I was wrong, I will only be glad. Okay, Dan forced himself to smile. Never mind. And let's keep this between us, okay? Of course, she squeezed his hand across the table. I'm not a gossip. I'm just worried about you. They finished their drinks, discussing work to ease the awkwardness. Caroline talked about the new intern who mixed up the catheters, and Dan even laughed, but his thoughts were somewhere else. When they said goodbye, he returned to the car, feeling a heaviness growing in his chest. The house was quiet. Laura hasn't returned yet. She wrote that she will be late for a meeting with a potential sponsor. Dan threw the keys on the table in the hallway and walked into the living room. Their home, with its wooden floors and large windows, had always felt like a sanctuary to him. The photos on the shelf, their wedding, the trip to Yellowstone, Mike's barbecue looked at him differently now. He stopped at a picture of the three of them laughing while holding glasses. Mike had his arm around Laura's shoulders, and Dan stood nearby, smiling. It seemed normal then. And now? He sat down on the sofa, rubbing his temples. This is nonsense, he told himself. Laura loved him. Mike was his best friend. They had been through so much together. College, early failures, Dan and Laura's wedding, where Mike was best man. But Caroline's words were playing in her head like a broken record. They kissed. Dan took out his phone to text Laura, but stopped. What will he say? Hey, did you happen to make out with Mike at the restaurant? It sounded stupid, paranoid. Instead, he wrote, Hi, are you home soon? I'm tired. I want to see you. The answer came a minute later. I'll be there soon, in another hour. I got a chatty sponsor. I will kiss you. Dan stared at the screen. Her words seemed the same as always, but now he was looking for a catch in them. He hated himself for it. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, and he didn't want to be the one to suspect his wife because of gossip. But the worm of doubt had already settled in his heart. Laura returned around 9 o'clock in the evening. Dan heard the front door slam, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. Dan, are you here? she called, entering the living room. She was wearing a dark blue dress, which she often wore to business meetings, and her hair was loose, slightly disheveled. Yeah, he got up from the couch, forcing himself to smile. How was the meeting? Tiring. Laura threw her purse on the chair and stretched. This guy from the construction company wants to invest money, but only if we name the new shelter after him. I had to convince him that it doesn't quite work that way. And how did you persuade? Dan looked at her, trying to catch something in her movements, in her voice. Not yet, but I'm not giving up. She smiled, but her gaze slid past him. How are you? You look tired. Long day, he shrugged, coming closer. Laura, are you? Is everything okay? She froze for a second, then nodded. Yes, sure. Just a lot of things to do. And what? Nothing. Dan shook his head, feeling like an idiot. You're just kind of absent-minded. Oh, Dan, it's just stress. Laura came up and hugged him, pressing her cheek to his chest. The foundation, the sponsors, you know how exhausting it is. I know, he hugged her back, but her warmth, usually soothing, now seemed alien. Maybe you should take a day off? Good idea. She pulled away, smiling. But not now. We need to put the squeeze on this auction. Okay, Dan nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. I'll go take a shower. And I'll make tea. Laura headed to the kitchen. Do you want green? Yes, thank you, he replied, already climbing the stairs. In the bathroom, under the hot water, Dan tried to push away thoughts of Caroline's words. He closed his eyes, imagining Laura and Mike in the restaurant. The picture was vague but painful. He knew he should talk to Laura, but he was afraid. He was afraid that the truth would destroy everything they had, or that he will make a mistake, and his suspicions will turn out to be empty, and trust will be undermined in vain. When he came down, Laura was sitting on the sofa with 2 mugs of tea. She handed him one, patting the spot next to her. Sit down, doctor. Tell me how your patients are doing. Dan sat down, accepting the mug. Everything is as usual. One guy asked today if he could drink beer after having a stent. Seriously? Laura laughed, and her laughter was so familiar, that Dan almost believed that everything was all right. And what did you say? What if he wants to live until next summer, then it's better to switch to water. Dan smiled, but his gaze involuntarily slid to her phone lying on the coffee table. Wise advice, Laura sipped her tea, looking at him. You're kind of thoughtful today. Are you sure everything is fine? Yes, he lied, forcing himself to look into her eyes. I'm just tired. I have surgery tomorrow. I need to get some sleep. Then let's go to bed early. She squeezed his hand. Your patients need you in uniform. They finished their tea, chatting about small things. Laura talked about a new volunteer at the foundation who accidentally sent auction invitations to the wrong people, and Dan even laughed. But inside he felt doubts growing like weeds, filling the entire space. Before going to bed, Dan lay in the dark, listening to Laura's even breathing. She fell asleep quickly, turning her back to him. He looked at her silhouette, illuminated by the faint light of the moon breaking through the curtains. The Rocky Mountains outside the window were silent, as always. Dan closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, he saw Laura and Mike, their hands, their looks. This is a mistake, he repeated to himself. But Caroline's words were louder. Tomorrow he will talk to Laura. Or not. He didn't know yet. Daniel sat in the living room, staring at the dark TV screen. The light from the table lamp cast long shadows on the wooden floor, and outside the window the Rocky Mountains dissolved into the darkness of the night. The clock showed 10 in the evening, but Laura still had not returned from her next meeting on the affairs of the foundation. Her message, sent an hour ago, read, I'm delayed, sponsors are delaying. I'll be there soon. Dan reread it, feeling the words Caroline Wilson said yesterday in the cafe burning him from the inside. They kissed. He clenched his fists, trying to push away the image of Laura and Mike, but it stubbornly returned. Dan stood up and walked around the room, stopping at a shelf with photographs. Their wedding, Laura in a white dress, her smile, his hand on her waist. Trip to Yellowstone, they laugh while splashed with geyser water. Mike's barbecue, all three of them with glasses under the bright sun. Dan looked at Mike, his wide smile, and for the first time in years of friendship, he felt a pang of hatred. "This is a mistake," he repeated to himself, but Caroline's words were like a splinter that could not be pulled out. The sound of the front door opening pulled him out of his thoughts. Laura entered, throwing her purse on the table in the hallway. Her blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and her cheeks were pink, as if from cold or wine. "Dan, are you still awake?" She smiled, taking off her coat. "Sorry it's so late. These sponsors are simply unbearable." "Nothing," Dan forced himself to answer calmly, although his voice sounded strained. "How did it go?" Tiring as always, Laura walked into the living room, rubbing her neck. "But it seems we have knocked out another 5,000 for the shelter. I'll have to thank Mike. He was a great help with contacts. Mike's name is cut like a knife." Dan looked at her, looking for any hint of a lie in her face, but Laura seemed the same as always, tired but inspired. "Mike, then," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "You spend a lot of time together." Laura froze for a second, then laughed and waved it off. "Well, you know how it works. Without his connections, half of my projects would have failed." She looked at him, narrowing her eyes. "Why are you so gloomy? Did something happen?" "No," Dan lied, feeling how everything inside was shrinking. "I'm just tired. I'll go take a shower." "Okay," Laura nodded, heading towards the kitchen. "Would you like me to make you a sandwich?" "No, I'm not hungry," he said, already climbing the stairs. In the bathroom, Dan turned on the water, but did not undress. He stood looking at his reflection in the mirror, dark circles under his eyes, a tense line of his mouth. "You're paranoid," he told himself. But Caroline's words haunted her. He knew he couldn't sleep until he was sure she was wrong, or that I was not mistaken. Laura was still in the kitchen when he came down. Her phone lay on the coffee table in the living room, face down. Dan froze, looking at him. His heart was beating so loudly that he was afraid Laura would hear. He never checked her phone. It was against their rules, against their trust. But now that trust was bursting at the seams. "Laura, how long have you been there?" He shouted to make sure she was busy. "Just a minute, I'm making tea," she responded from the kitchen. Dan picked up the phone, his fingers trembling. The code was simple their wedding day, 0612. The screen lit up, revealing the main screen. He quickly found the messages and scrolled down to Mike's name. Their correspondence was long, too long for simple business conversations. Dan opened it, and his gaze caught the last lines. "Mike, I miss you. Tomorrow at 7, as usual. Laura, I can't wait. Just be careful. Dan suspects something." Dan felt the floor disappear from under his feet. He scrolled up, and each message was like a blow. "Mike, you were incredible yesterday. That hotel is our new favorite. Laura, just don't write something like that, in case someone sees it. Mike, nobody will see. Dan is too busy saving the world." Dan scrolled further, his breathing becoming heavier. Photo, Laura and Mike in a hotel room. She is wearing his shirt. He has his arm around her waist. Another one, they are in a restaurant. The same, the copper pot. Their faces are close. Their eyes are shining. The messages dragged on for months, almost a year. Hearts, kisses, hints of meetings. Dan felt his throat tighten and a fire flare up in his chest. The sound of footsteps made him flinch. He threw the phone on the table just as Laura came in with 2 mugs of tea. "Dan." She stopped, her gaze darting to the phone, then to his face. "What are you doing?" He stood up, his hands shaking with rage. "How long, Laura?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "How long have you been sleeping with Mike?" Laura turned pale. The mugs almost fell out of her hands. She placed them on the table, her lips trembling. "Dan, what are you talking about?" Her voice was weak, but there was already panic in it. "Don't lie to me." He stepped towards her, pointing at the phone. "I saw everything. Correspondence, photos, everything. 1 year, Laura. You've been deceiving me for a whole year." She covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders trembled. "Dan, please let me explain." Explain? He raised his voice, which he never did with her. What is there to explain? You sleep with my best friend while I'm in the hospital saving people, while I think everything is perfect with us. It's not that simple. Laura lowered her hands, her eyes full of tears. I didn't want it to turn out like this. It, it just happened. Did it happen? Dan laughed bitterly, stepping back. A year, Laura. You dated him for a year behind my back. You laughed at me. I didn't laugh. She stepped towards him, extending her hand, but he recoiled. Dan, I love you. It was a mistake. I was confused. Confused? He looked at her, feeling pain mixed with rage. Were you confused when you kissed him? When did you take these photos? When you lied to me every day? Laura sobbed, pressing her hands to her face. Mike, he was there when you weren't. You're always in the hospital, Dan. I felt alone. Lonely? His voice trembled, but he didn't let himself break. You could have told me. We could talk, decide. But you chose him. My friend? I didn't choose him. Laura almost screamed. Her voice was trembling. It wasn't a choice. I don't know how to explain this. He understood me. That's enough. Dan raised his hand, stopping her. I don't want to hear it. You ruined everything, Laura. Everything we had. She cried, standing in the middle of the living room, but Dan did not feel pity. He felt empty, as if someone had ripped out a part of his soul. He turned and grabbed his keys and coat. Where are you? Laura rushed after him, her voice filled with terror. Dan, please don't leave. We can fix anything. To correct? He turned around, looking into her eyes. Do you think this can be fixed? I can't stay here. He left, slamming the door without looking back. The cold night air hit his face, but he barely noticed it. Dan got into the car, gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, and drove away. He did not know where, but he knew that he could not return to this house, saturated with lies. An hour later, he found himself at a small hotel on the outskirts of Denver. The room was simple, beige walls, a bed with a hard mattress, the smell of cleaning products. Dan threw his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, staring into space. His phone vibrated. Laura called, then wrote, Dan, come back. I'm begging. We can talk. I know I'm guilty. Please give me a chance. He turned off the phone without answering. His mind was in chaos. Images of Laura and Mike, their messages, her tears. He remembered how proud he was of her, how he boasted to colleagues with her charity, how he trusted Mike, his friend who was there for him in his darkest times. All this turned out to be false. Dan lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling. The Rocky Mountains, visible through the thin curtains, were silent. He closed his eyes, but instead of sleeping, he saw only her face, his smile, and their lies. The truth was revealed, and now he had to decide what to do next. But that night he knew only one thing: he would not return home. Daniel woke up in his hotel room, his neck aching from the uncomfortable pillow. The dim light of the morning filtered through the thin curtains, drawing stripes on the beige walls. He lay looking at the ceiling until the memories of last night came flooding back with renewed vigor. His heart sank, but Dan forced himself to stand up. He couldn't let the pain take over, not now, when he needed to figure out what to do next. In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face, looking at his reflection. Dark circles under the eyes, stubble, tired look. You're a cardiologist, you handle crises, he told himself, but the words sounded empty. This was not a crisis in the operating room, where he could rely on a scalpel and experience. This was his life, torn to shreds by the betrayal of his wife and friend. Dan turned on the phone, ignoring a dozen missed calls and messages from Laura. Her last message read, Dan, I know you're angry. Please talk to me. He gritted his teeth and removed it without answering. Instead, he opened his contacts and found the number of Nick Torres, an old friend turned private investigator. Nick was straightforward, a little rough, but reliable. If anyone could help make sense of this nightmare, it would be him. Dan dialed the number, listening to the dial tone. Nick answered after the third, his voice hoarse as if he had just woken up. Dan, damn, do you know what time it is? Nick coughed and Dan heard him take a sip of something, probably coffee. 7 in the morning, Dan answered, looking at his watch. Sorry, it's early. I need your help. What happened? Nick's tone became more serious. Are you okay? Not really, Dan hesitated, not knowing how to start. This is personal. Laura, she cheated on me with Mike Stanton. There was silence on the other end, then Nick whistled. Seriously? Mike, your fitness guru friend? This is the twist. How did you know? I checked her phone. Correspondence, photos, everything is there. 1 year, Nick. They dated for a year behind my back. Dan squeezed the phone so that his fingers turned white. Damn, man, this sucks, Nick sighed. What do you want? Just to know more or something else? I want to know everything, Dan said, his voice firm despite the storm inside. Everything they did, where, when. Got it. Nick paused, as if figuring out a plan. Give me a couple of days to gather information. Where are you now? Not at home, I take it. At the hotel. Pineview Inn, on the outskirts. I don't want to go home. Smart. Sit quietly, don't call her, don't make a scene. Nick paused. And Dan, I'm really sorry. Thank you. Dan swallowed the lump in his throat. Keep me posted. I'll do it. Nick passed out, and Dan remained in the silence of the room, feeling a little less alone. Nick was his ally, the shadow that could bring the truth to light. In the hospital, Dan tried to control himself. He put on a white coat, adjusted his badge, and entered the operating room, where the team was waiting for him. Today, there was a complex operation coronary artery bypass surgery for a 60-year-old man. Dan knew that he had no right to be distracted, but thoughts about Laura and Mike crawled into his head like annoying flies. Dr. Harper, are you ready? Caroline Wilson, standing at the monitor, looked at him with slight concern. She didn't mention yesterday's conversation, but her look said, she knows he's not okay. Yes, Dan nodded, putting on his gloves. Let's begin. The operation went smoothly, although Dan found himself losing focus a couple of times as the assistant passed around the instruments. Fortunately, his hands worked on autopilot. Years of practice were not in vain. Once the patient was stabilized and sent to the intensive care unit, Dan exhaled as he removed his mask. Good job, doctor, the anesthesiologist said, clapping him on the shoulder. You are like a robot, not a single unnecessary emotion. I'm trying. Dan forced himself to smile, but inside he felt that he was definitely not a robot. In the staff room, he poured himself some coffee, trying not to look at the phone. Laura sent another message. Dan, please answer. I can't do this. He erased it without opening it. Instead, he wrote to Nick. Is there anything? The answer came a minute later. Just started. Laura is at the foundation office today. Mike is at his club. Nothing suspicious yet. I'll let you know if anything happens. Dan put the phone away. In the evening, returning to the hotel, Dan felt exhausted. The room seemed even more empty than in the morning, and the smell of cleaning product was irritating. He ordered pizza, but the food seemed tasteless. Sitting on his bed, he turned on the TV, but news about local politics only increased his anxiety. He turned it off and took out his laptop to distract himself, but instead of working, he opened a photo album. Photos with Laura, their first vacation in Mexico, her laughter on the carousel in the park, their wedding. Dan looked at her face, trying to figure out when everything went wrong. Was she unhappy? Why didn't she tell me? And Mike? How could he? Dan remembered how Mike supported him when his father died, how they drank beer and talked until the morning. This was a betrayal not only of marriage, but also of friendship. The phone vibrated, jerking him out of his memories. It was Nick. Dan, do you have a minute? Nick's voice was businesslike, but with a hint of excitement. Yes, what do you have? Dan sat up straighter, feeling his pulse quicken. I followed Laura today. She was at the foundation office until 6, then went to the center. Met Mike at a cafe, not the one Caroline mentioned, but another one, Blue Ridge. They stayed there for about an hour. And Dan held his breath. Nothing obvious, but they were sitting close, too close for a business meeting. I took a couple of photos, but they are not particularly incriminating. It just doesn't feel like work, you know. I understand. Dan clenched his jaw. What's next? Tomorrow Mike has a meeting at his main club, and Laura is going to some charity dinner. I'll see if they intersect. And also, I dug into their schedules over the past months. They went to the same places often, Dan. Hotels, restaurants. Hotels. Dan felt everything getting colder inside. Which? One in the center, Silver Peak. I'll check their reservations, but it will take time. If you want, I can dig deeper, look at their finances, correspondence, everything I can get. Do whatever you have to, Dan said, his voice firm, but inside he was shaking. I want to know the truth, Nick. Everything until the end. Understood. But Dan, control yourself, okay? Don't call her, don't write to her. If they are hiding something, we will catch them. I won't lose my temper, Dan promised, although he was not sure of his words. Thank you, Nick. My pleasure. Get some sleep, man. Tomorrow will be a long day. Dan turned off the call and leaned back against the pillows. His gaze fell on the window, beyond which the Rocky Mountains loomed in the darkness like silent sentinels. He felt on the edge of an abyss, but Nick was his rope, his chance to make sense of this chaos. The next day at the hospital, Dan was in a daze. He held consultations, smiled at patients, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Caroline, noticing his aloofness, caught him in the hallway during a break. Dan, are you okay? She lowered her voice so that others would not hear. You look, I don't know, lost. It's okay, he lied, avoiding her gaze. I just didn't get enough sleep. If it has anything to do with what I said. She began, but Dan raised his hand. Caroline, thanks, but I'll sort it out. Is it true? She nodded, but her gaze was full of concern. Dan went to the staff room, feeling guilty for being so abrupt. He didn't want to push her away, but he couldn't talk about Laura. Not now, when the truth was so fragile and painful. In the evening, Nick sent a message. Laura and Mike crossed paths at dinner. Dan read it while sitting in his hotel room and felt rage mixed with determination. It had been 3 days since Dan had left home, and each hour seemed to drag on like an eternity. He tried to concentrate on his work, but the thoughts of betraying his wife and best friend were like poison, slowly poisoning his mind. The phone vibrated and Dan grabbed it, seeing Nick's name on the screen. Nick, what do you have? He asked without wasting time on greetings. His voice was hoarse, tense. Dan, are you sitting? Nick's voice was businesslike, but with a note that made Dan wary. I dug into Laura and Mike's affairs, and damn it, it's not just an affair. What do you mean? Dan stood up and began to pace his steps around the cramped room. His heart beat faster. I checked their movements over the past months. They met in hotels, restaurants, and even went on weekend trips together, passing it off as business trips. But here's what's interesting. Many of these bills were not paid from their personal funds. The money came from Laura's charitable foundation. Dan froze, his fingers clenching the phone. Fonda, are you saying? They stole money that should have gone to shelters. Exactly, Nick confirmed. I found several receipts, rooms at Silver Peak, dinners at the Copper Pot, even tickets to some resort in Vail. Everything is framed as expenses for fund events. But Dan, there are no events there. These are their personal hangouts. Damn. Dan sank onto the bed, feeling the air leaving his lungs. Laura, whom he considered a paragon of virtue, an angel of Denver, was embezzling money raised for children and the homeless. It was worse than cheating. It was a betrayal of everything he believed in. You are sure? 100%, Nick replied. I have copies of checks and statements that I got through an acquaintance at the bank, plus recordings from cameras in Silver Peak. Laura and Mike appeared there at least 3 times in 6 months. I'm still digging, but this is already serious. Is Mike in on this too? Dan clenched his jaw, imagining the smug smile of his former friend. Yeah, his signature appears on some translations as a consultant of the fund. Smart, right? They covered each other. Nick paused. Dan, this is not just a novel. This is a scam. If this comes out, they'll both be in deep trouble. I want this to come up, Dan said, his voice as cold as the mountain wind outside the window. I want them to pay for everything. I understand, Nick spoke calmly, but Dan felt that he shared his anger. But we need ironclad proof. What I have is just the beginning. I can ask for more bank details, check their email if possible, but it will take time. Do what you need to do, Dan clenched his fist. Money, resources, whatever is needed. I won't stop until I get the whole truth out. Okay, Nick chuckled. But control yourself, okay? Don't call Laura, don't start a showdown with Mike. If they suspect we're digging, they might cover our tracks. I won't lose it, Dan promised, although the rage inside him burned like wildfire. Just find everything you can. I'll do it. I'll talk to a couple of contacts and check on their movements this week. I'll let you know as soon as there's something new. Nick paused. And Dan, hang in there. It's crap, but you can handle it. Thanks, Nick. Dan turned off the call, feeling himself shaking. He threw the phone on the bed and walked through the number, trying to calm the storm in his chest. Laura didn't just cheat on him, she lied to the entire city, using her fund as a personal wallet, and Mike, his friend, was her accomplice. Dan stood at the window, looking at the mountains. He remembered Laura talking about her latest project raising funds for an orphanage. Her eyes sparkled when she talked about the children who would receive new beds, books, toys. He was proud of her, boasting to his colleagues that his wife was changing the world. And now he saw only the lies hidden behind her smile. Dan was like a shadow in the hospital. He conducted his morning rounds, discussed the patient's condition with colleagues, but his thoughts were far away. Caroline Wilson, noticing his detachment, caught him in the hallway after the consultation. Dan, you look like you haven't slept in a week, she said, crossing her arms. Her tone was soft, but there was concern in her eyes. Is it because of what we talked about? Dan wanted to brush it off, but her sincerity stopped him. Yes, he admitted, lowering his voice. You were right, Laura. She's with Mike. I found evidence. Caroline sighed, her face softening. Damn, Dan, I'm so sorry. I hoped I was wrong. Me too, he smiled bitterly. But that's not all. They stole money from her fund. They used them for their meetings. Her eyes widened. Seriously? Laura, everyone considers her a saint. That's right, Dan looked away, feeling the pain mixed with anger. I want to expose them, Caroline. But I need time. I understand, she squeezed his shoulder. If you need anything, tell me. I'm not a gossip, but I'm on your side. Thank you, Dan nodded, feeling slightly relieved. Caroline was more than just a colleague, she was someone he could trust. He returned to the staff room, trying to concentrate on his work. But every time he opened the patient's chart, Laura and Mike's messages and photos of them in the hotel flashed before his eyes. He knew he had to hold on, but it was like holding a hot coal in his hands. In the evening, Nick sent a message. I found something else. Meet me tomorrow at 8 m. Mountain Brew Cafe. I'll bring the documents. Dan responded with a short okay and lay down on the bed, feeling the fatigue rolling in like a wave. He hadn't eaten since the morning, but he had no appetite. Instead, he opened his laptop and started looking for information about Laura's fund, Bright Futures. The website was colorful, full of photos of smiling children and volunteers. Laura was on the main page, her smile shining like a beacon. We change lives, the headline read. Dan gritted his teeth, closing the tab. He remembered how Laura first told him about the foundation, back when they first started dating. Her eyes sparkled when she talked about helping those in need. Then he fell in love with her even more, thinking that he had found his soul mate, and now he saw only hypocrisy. The next morning, Dan arrived at Mountain Brew 10 minutes before the appointed time. The cafe was almost empty, except for a couple of students sitting in the corner, their heads glued to their laptops. Dan ordered an espresso and sat by the window, looking out at the morning Denver. The city was waking up. Cars were honking, passers-by were hurrying along the sidewalks, and the mountains in the distance seemed eternal and indifferent. Nick came in carrying a tattered leather folder. His dark hair was tousled, and there were shadows under his eyes. It was clear that he had been working all night. "You look lousy," Nick said, sitting down opposite him and ordering black coffee. "You too," Dan smiled faintly. "What did you bring?" Nick opened the folder, pulling out several printouts. "Here, look. Extracts from the fund's accounts for the last 6 months. Do you see these translations?" He pointed to the lines highlighted with a marker. "This includes paying for rooms at Silver Peak, dinners at restaurants, even renting a car for a trip to Vail. Everything is framed as expenses for charitable events." Dan ran his eyes over the numbers. Thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, spent on luxury hotels and restaurants. His stomach clenched. "Is this really theirs?" "Yeah," Nick nodded, pulling out another sheet. "Here's a receipt from Silver Peak, signed by Laura as director of the foundation. And here is the recording from the camera. They enter the room together." He showed a grainy photo of Laura and Mike holding hands as they walked down a hotel hallway. Dan felt the rage return, hot and suffocating. "They used the children's money for their dates," he hissed. "How could she? People are capable of a lot when they think they won't get caught." Nick shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "But we will catch them. I have already requested access to their email through one hacker. If there's something else there, we'll find it." "What's next?" Dan looked at him. His gaze was firm. "I want them to answer this. Not just for treason, for everything." "We need more evidence first," Nick said, tapping his fingers on the folder. "These extracts are a good start, but to expose them you need something that can't be unscrewed. Financial reports, signatures, maybe testimony from someone from the fund. I'll check their employees, maybe someone knows more than they say." And then, Dan leaned closer. "Then we can pass this on to the media or directly to the prosecutor's office." Nick lowered his voice. "But Dan, it will be loud. Laura is a public figure. Mike is a famous businessman. If we pin them down, it will blow up Denver. Are you ready for this?" "I'm ready." Dan clenched his jaw. "They ruined my life. Let them try to hide now." Nick nodded, his gaze full of respect. "Then I keep digging. And you stay away from them. If they suspect we're on our tail, they might destroy the evidence." "I understand." Dan took the folder, feeling its weight in his hands. "Thank you, Nick." "You're welcome." Nick finished his coffee and stood up. "Get some sleep, man. You look like a patient before surgery." Dan smiled faintly, but there was no room for jokes inside him. He looked at the folder, feeling his determination grow. Laura and Mike thought they could lie and steal with impunity, but he was going to prove to them that the truth always comes out. Daniel sat in the corner of the Mountain Brew Cafe, nervously tapping his fingers on the rim of his coffee cup. The morning Denver was seething outside the window. Cars honked, passers-by hurried along the sidewalks, and the Rocky Mountains in the distance were silent, shrouded in a light fog. Dan barely slept that night. His thoughts were occupied with news from Nick Torres. Laura and Mike were not only cheating on him, but also stealing money from her charitable foundation. The folder of statements and checks lying in front of him seemed like a bomb ready to explode their perfect facade. But for this to work, he needed someone to turn the evidence into a weapon. Nick suggested reaching out to Emily Rose, a journalist who exposes on corruption in local businesses and nonprofits had made waves in Denver. Dan agreed, although the idea of publicizing his personal pain was daunting. He wanted justice, but he wasn't ready for his life to become headline news. The cafe door dinged, and a woman of about 35, with short dark hair and sharp eyes, entered. She was wearing a gray jacket, jeans, and thin-framed glasses. She looked around the hall, noticed Dan, and headed towards him. "Dr. Harper?" she asked, holding out her hand. Her voice was confident, but not harsh. "Yes." Dan stood up, shaking her hand. "Emily Rose?" "To the point," she smiled, sitting down opposite. "Nick Torres said you have something interesting." Dan nodded, feeling his throat go dry. He took a sip of coffee, collecting his thoughts. This is a complicated story, personal, but not only. My wife, Laura, and my friend, Michael Stanton, cheated on me. And it seems not only me. Emily raised an eyebrow as she opened her notebook. Tell me more. Nick mentioned something about a charity. Dan took a deep breath and began. He talked about how he found correspondence between Laura and Mike about their year-long romance and about how Nick discovered that they were using Laura's fund, Bright Futures, to pay for personal expenses, hotels, restaurants, travel. He opened the folder, laying out the transcripts and photographs from the surveillance cameras in front of Emily. Here are the receipts, he said, pointing to the printouts. These are rooms at Silver Peak, dinners at the Copper Pot. The money came from a fund that was supposed to help children and the homeless. Emily ran her eyes over the documents. Her face remained expressionless, but her gaze became sharper. This is serious, she said, tapping her pen on the notepad. If this is true, then Laura Harper and Michael Stanton are not just scammers, but public figures who deceived the entire city. It's true, Dan clenched his jaw. I want them to answer this. Not just for treason, for everything. Emily leaned back in her chair, looking at him. I understand your anger, Doctor, but for this to become an article, I need more. These statements are a good start, but they are not ironclad. I need signatures, correspondence, and testimony from witnesses. Something that won't let them get away with it. Nick is working on it, Dan said. He checks their mail, looks for other financial traces. Maybe get more camera footage. Great, Emily nodded, but I have to dig too. I can talk to the fund's employees and check their reports. If there is someone there who knows about the fraud, that will be our trump card. Dan felt a slight sense of relief. Emily spoke with such confidence that he began to believe that the truth might come out. How long will it take? He asked. Depends on what we find, she shrugged. A week, maybe two. But doctor, you have to understand, if I take this on, the story will become big. Your name will likely come up too. Are you ready for this? Dan hesitated. He imagined the headlines, cardiologist exposes cheating wife. His colleagues, patients, friends, everyone will know. But then he remembered Laura, her smile hiding the lie, and Mike patting him on the shoulder while he slept with his wife. I'm ready, he said firmly. They must not get away unpunished. Okay, Emily closed the notebook. Then I'll start. Give Nick my number. Let him tell me anything he finds. And doctor, stay away from Laura and Mike. If they suspect you're digging, it will complicate matters. I understand, Dan nodded, although the rage inside him demanded action. Emily stood up, holding out her hand. We'll get them, but you have to play smart. Thank you, Dan shook her hand, feeling his determination grow. Emily was not just a journalist, she was his chance for justice. At the hospital, Dan tried to get back into a routine, but it was like walking through a minefield. He was consulting with a patient, an elderly man with hypertension, but his mind was elsewhere. Doctor, are you listening to me? The patient, Mr. Clark, narrowed his eyes on him. Yes, of course, Dan forced himself to smile. You talked about headaches. Let's increase the dose of lisinopril and see how it goes. Mr. Clark nodded, but his gaze was skeptical. Dan knew he didn't look his best, pale, with circles under his eyes. Caroline Wilson, who came into the office to hand over the tests, gave him a worried look. Dan, are you sure you don't need a day off? She asked when the patient left. I need to work, he snapped, leafing through the papers. This is the only thing that keeps me normal. Work won't save you from everything, Caroline said softly. If you want, we can talk. Thank you, but I can handle it. Dan looked at her, softening his tone. Is it true? She nodded, but her look said she didn't believe it. Dan turned back to his papers, but his thoughts were with Nick and Emily. He imagined them rummaging through accounts, correspondence, records, pulling out the dirt that Laura and Mike had hidden so carefully. In the evening, Nick called. His voice was excited. Dan, I got something else, he said. Correspondence between Laura and the fund accountant. She asked to re-register several accounts to hide the expenses. And one more thing, Mike transferred money to an account associated with his fitness clubs under the guise of sponsorship fees. Is this it? Dan felt his pulse quicken. Enough for Emily? Not yet, Nick sighed. This confirms fraud, but we need more context. I'm trying to get their emails, but it's not that easy. Plus, I checked the cameras at the Copper Pot, and they were there more often than I thought. New posts coming soon. Great, Dan squeezed the phone. Tell everything to Emily. Already, Nick chuckled. She's like a shark. She smells blood. She said that she would talk to a couple of Foundation volunteers. If anyone knows about dark affairs, she will split them up. Thank you, Nick. Dan felt slightly relieved. I don't know what I would do without you. You'll bury me in flowers when this is over, Nick joked. In the meantime, hold on. And don't look at her pictures, okay? It won't help. Dan smiled weakly as he hung up the call. He knew Nick was right, but he opened the album on his laptop anyway. A photo of Laura at their wedding, her eyes full of love. Now he saw only lies in them. He closed the laptop, lay down on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. The Rocky Mountains outside were silent, but Dan felt his new plan gaining momentum. Laura and Mike thought no one would catch them, but they were wrong. Dan Harper sat in the residence room, flipping through a patient's medical history, but his eyes kept getting unfocused. The Rocky Mountains outside the hospital window were hidden by the morning fog, and Denver seemed gray and cold, like his own mood. It's been a week since he left home after learning of Laura and Mike's betrayal, and 4 days since Nick Torres uncovered their fraud with the charity. Dan felt on edge. Rage and pain fought inside, but he held on, knowing that Nick and journalist Emily Rose were collecting evidence to expose Laura and Mike. His phone vibrated and Dan glanced at the screen, waiting for a message from Nick. But it was an email from Miller and Associates. Subject: Notice of filing for divorce. Dan's heart skipped a beat. He opened the letter, and every word was like a blow. Laura Harper had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences as the reason and accusing him of emotional abuse and ignoring her needs. She claimed Dan was obsessed with work, leaving her feeling abandoned and depressed. Dan clutched the phone, his fingers turning white. Laura, who had been cheating on him with Mike for a year, who had been stealing money from the fund, was now exposing him as a monster. He felt the rage boil, but it was followed by pain, the pain that the woman he loved was ready to destroy his reputation. He dialed Nick without giving himself time to change his mind. Nick, did you see this? His voice trembled with anger. Laura filed for divorce. Accuses me of emotional abuse. Damn, Nick whistled on the other end. She plays dirty. This is her move to get ahead of you. If you reveal evidence, she will say that you are just taking revenge. She's trying to ruin my life. Dan clenched his fist, looking at the mountains outside the window. I won't let her do this. Calm down, Dan, Nick spoke firmly. We are one step ahead. Emily is already working with a volunteer from the foundation who saw Laura redistribute the money. If we collect enough, no one will take her accusations seriously. How much more do you need? Dan walked around the staff room, feeling the walls shrinking. A week, maybe 2, Nick answered. I got a couple more recordings from the cameras and Laura's correspondence with Mike via the foundation's corporate mail. There they discuss how to cover up spending. It's almost evidence. Okay, Dan exhaled, trying to pull himself together. Keep me posted. And Dan, don't answer her, Nick added. Let him think that you are in shock. This will give us time. Dan turned off the call, but his hands were still shaking. He looked at the letter, rereading the phrase, emotional abuse. How could she? He remembered their evenings, her laughter, their hugs. It was all a lie, and now she was rewriting their history to save herself. At the hospital, Dan tried to keep his face, but news of the divorce began to leak out. By lunchtime, he noticed his colleagues whispering to each other, casting sidelong glances at him. Caroline Wilson, his nurse, caught him in the hallway after his rounds. Dan, I heard about the divorce, she said quietly, her eyes full of sympathy. This is true. Yes, Dan looked away, feeling his throat tighten. Laura gave it to me, and she says I was cruel to her. Cruel? Caroline frowned. You, Dan, I've been working with you for 5 years. You are the kindest person I know. Thank you, he smiled bitterly, but it seems that not everyone thinks so. Caroline squeezed his hand. Don't listen to gossip. People love to dramatize. You can handle it. But Caroline's words could not drown out the growing noise. By the end of the day, one of the patients, an elderly woman, refused to consult with Dan, citing personal reasons. His assistant, a young intern named Todd, awkwardly reported this, avoiding eye contact. She said she heard, well, about your divorce, Todd muttered, and that you don't seem to be a very good person. Dan felt the blood rush to his temples. Thank you, Todd, he said coldly. Appoint her to Dr. Levy. He went into the staff room, closing the door. Rumors spread like wildfire, and he knew who started them. Laura, with her public image as the Angel of Denver, could convince anyone that she was a victim. And he, a cardiologist whose life was dedicated to saving people, now looked like a tyrant in the eyes of his colleagues and patients. That evening Dan returned to the hotel, feeling devastated. His room, with its beige walls and hard bed, seemed like a cage. He opened his laptop to distract himself, but instead of working, he went on social networks. In a local Denver group, he came across a post. Did you hear about Laura Harper's divorce? They say her husband, a doctor, was a real control freak. The comments were full of gossip. Someone wrote that they saw Dan yelling at Laura at some event. Others claimed that he was always cold. Dan slammed his laptop shut, his breathing heavy. Laura didn't just file for divorce, she launched a campaign to destroy his reputation. He remembered her tears that night when he found the correspondence, her pleas to give her a chance. Now he saw that it was a game to buy time and strike first. He dialed Emily Rose, unable to remain silent any longer. Emily, this is Dan, he said when she answered. Laura filed for divorce. Accuses me of violence. Rumors are already all over the city. Damn, Emily paused, her voice becoming businesslike. She plays ahead. He wants to make you out to be a villain so that no one will believe your evidence. I know, Dan clenched his fist. Can we speed up the investigation? I don't want her to win. We're working, Emily answered. Nick sent new correspondence Laura, and Mike discussed how to optimize the fund's reports. I'm meeting tomorrow with a former volunteer who knows about their schemes. But Dan, we need a little more. If we release an article without hard evidence, they will smear us. How much longer? His voice was full of despair. A couple of days, a week at most, she said. Hold on, we'll get them. As thank you, Dan turned off the call, but Emily's words did not lift the weight from his chest. He lay down on the bed, looking at the ceiling. The Rocky Mountains outside the window were barely visible in the darkness. Their silence seemed a mockery. Laura hit where it hurt most: his reputation, his honor. But he wasn't going to give up. Dan, you have a visitor, she said, lowering her voice. Michael Stanton. He's in the hall and wants to talk. Dan froze, his heart skipped a beat. Mike, the man he considered a friend, who slept with his wife and stole the foundation's money, now came to him. Anger flared, but Dan forced himself to breathe evenly. What does he want? He asked, his voice as cold as the mountain wind. I didn't say, Caroline shrugged, but he looks confident. Do you want me to tell you that you are busy? No, Dan shook his head, his gaze becoming firm. I'll talk to him. Where is he? In the reception waiting area, she answered, adding more quietly, Be careful, Dan. He nodded, straightened his robe, and left the staff room. The hospital corridors were filled with the usual noise. Pagers ringing, nurses' footsteps, patients' voices. But for Dan, all this faded into the background. He felt the blood pulsating in his temples, and every step brought him closer to the man who had destroyed his world. Mike Stanton stood at the reception desk, dressed in an expensive dark blue suit, with perfectly coiffed hair and an easy smile that always seemed friendly to Dan. Now it looked like a mask. Mike was tall, with broad shoulders, and his presence filled the space. He turned, noticing Dan, and his smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Dan, good to see you," Mike said, extending his hand. His voice was smooth, as if they had met at a barbecue rather than in the middle of a betrayal. Dan ignored the hand, crossing his own over his chest. "What do you need, Mike?" His tone was icy, and he made no attempt to hide his anger. Mike lowered his hand, his smile faltering slightly. "Talk, without prying eyes. Is there somewhere quieter?" Dan nodded, pointing to the empty consultation room at the end of the hallway. He didn't want their conversation to become a show for his colleagues, who were already whispering about his divorce. They walked in and Dan closed the door, leaving it slightly ajar in case Mike decided to play dirty. "Talk," Dan said, leaning against the wall and looking into Mike's eyes. Mike adjusted the cuffs of his jacket. His movements were precise, like those of a man accustomed to being in control of the situation. "Dan, I know you're angry," he began, his voice soft, almost sympathetic, "and I don't blame you. The situation with Laura, it's out of control." "Out of control?" Dan laughed bitterly, stepping closer. "You slept with my wife for a year, Mike. You looked me in the eyes, called me a friend, and you stole money from her fund for your dates. It's not out of control. This is betrayal." Mike raised his hands as if in surrender. "Look, I'm not going to make excuses. Yes, Laura and I. It happened. I didn't plan, no one planned. But feelings, they don't ask permission." "Feelings?" Dan clenched his fists, his voice shaking with rage. "You call these feelings? You lied to me, you lied to everyone. What about the fund's money? Are these also feelings?" Mike winced, but quickly regained his composure. "The foundation is a different story. Yes, there were. Not quite the right expenses. But that's not stealing, Dan. We just optimized resources. No one was hurt. No one was hurt." Dan raised his voice, his patience ran out. "The children for whom this money was intended suffered. The homeless people you and Laura promised to help. You stand here in your $1,000 suit and you dare say no one got hurt." "Quiet, Dan." Mike lowered his voice, looking back at the door. "Don't make a scene. I didn't come to argue. I came to offer a solution." "Solution?" Dan squinted, feeling how cold everything inside was. "What other solution?" Mike leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. "We can work this out amicably. You're angry, and I understand. But think about it. If you continue to dig, it will hit not only us, but also you. All these rumors about your violence are just the beginning. People love drama, Dan. They will say that you are taking revenge, that you are unstable. Your career, your patience, everything is at risk. Are you threatening me?" Dan stepped towards him, his eyes burning. "No," Mike shook his head, but his smile was cold. "I'm offering a deal. Laura and I are ready to compensate for your losses. Let's say 100,000. Enough to start a new life. You remain silent, we settle the divorce quietly, and everyone is happy." Dan looked at him, not believing his ears. $100,000 for his silence. For betrayal, for lies, for a broken marriage. Fury surged through him, and he barely managed to stop himself from hitting Mike. "Do you think I'll sell my honor for your dirty money?" he growled. "You and Laura stole from the children, from the city, from me. I won't just shut up, Mike. I will expose you. Everyone will know who you are." Mike straightened up, his face hardening. "You're making a mistake, Dan. I'm trying to be reasonable. But if you want war, you will get it. And believe me, you are not ready for what we can do." "Get out," Dan pointed to the door, his voice full of threat, "until I threw you out myself." Mike looked at him, his eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this," he said coldly, then turned and walked out, leaving behind him the smell of expensive cologne and the echo of his words. Dan stood there, breathing heavily, his hands shaking. The tension between them had reached its peak, and he knew this was just the beginning. Mike didn't just threaten, he showed that he was willing to play dirty. But Dan was not going to back down. Returning to the staff room, Dan closed the door and leaned against the wall, trying to calm down. His thoughts were confused. Mike knew what he was digging, and this made the investigation even more dangerous. He dialed Nick, his voice hoarse with anger. "Nick, Mike was just here," he said. "He offered 100,000 for silence. He threatened to destroy me if I didn't stop." "Bastard," Nick swore. "He's panicking, Dan. This means we are close. He knows what we're digging." Dan squeezed the phone. "It's dangerous." "I know," Nick lowered his voice. "I increased my caution. I changed the car, I worked through a proxy, but you two be on your guard. Don't walk alone, don't open unfamiliar letters." "I got it," Dan exhaled. "What do we have?" "Emily received the camera footage from the copper pot," Nick answered. "Laura and Mike are there 3 times in a month, and these are not business meetings. Plus, I hacked their email. There is a letter where Laura asks the accountant to re-register the hotel bill as a sponsorship fee. It's almost evidence. Send everything to Emily," Dan said, "and tell her Mike is threatening. She should know." "Already," Nick paused. "Dan, are you sure you want to go all the way? This is not just a divorce. This is war." "I'm sure," Dan clenched his jaw. "They ruined my life. I will destroy their lies." "Then hold on," Nick said. "We're almost there." Dan hung up the call, feeling his determination return. Mike thought he could buy him or intimidate him, but he underestimated Dan. He was not just a deceived husband, he was a man who would not let a lie win. In the hospital, Dan tried to keep his face up, but the pressure was growing. Caroline noticed his condition and tried to talk, but he brushed it off, not wanting to involve her. Rumors of his cruelty continued to spread, and another patient refused consultation, citing personal reasons. Dan felt his reputation crumbling at the seams, but knew he had to hold out until the truth came out. That evening, back at the hotel, he opened the evidence file, rereading the statements and the insurance letter. Every word, every number added fuel into the fire of his determination. Mike and Laura thought they could manipulate him, but they were wrong. Dan closed the folder and lay down, looking at the dark silhouettes of the Rocky Mountains. The tension was at its peak, but he was ready to fight. Daniel woke up to the sound of notifications breaking the silence of his hotel room. He reached for the phone, wincing from the light of the screen. Messages from Nick Torres, Caroline Wilson, and even a few colleagues filled the chat. But one thing stood out from Emily Rose. "The article is out. Check the Denver Chronicle website." Dan's heart began to pound. He opened the laptop, feeling the adrenaline dispel the remnants of sleep. The Rocky Mountains outside the window, illuminated by the morning sun, seemed to bear witness to the fact that his life was about to change forever. On the Denver Chronicle's front page was the headline, "Charity or Scam? How the Bright Futures Fund Became Laura Harper's Personal Wallet." The subtitle was even stronger. "Documents and evidence reveal how money for children and homeless people was spent on hotels and luxury dinners." Dan skimmed the article, his breathing getting heavier with each line. Emily Rose wrote it all up. Billing statements showing how thousands of dollars were spent on rooms at Silver Peak and dinners at the Copper Pot. CCTV footage of Laura and Mike entering the hotel holding hands. Anonymous testimony from a foundation volunteer who claimed that Laura re-registered accounts to hide personal expenses. The article ended with a hint of Laura's relationship with Michael Stanton, a prominent businessman whose consulting services for the foundation looked suspicious. Dan closed his laptop, his hands shaking. This was what he had been waiting for, the truth, pulled out of the shadows. But instead of triumph, he felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The scandal was just beginning, and he knew that the storm would affect everyone. The phone rang and Dan answered, seeing Nick's name. "Have you seen it?" Nick spoke quickly, his voice full of excitement. "Emily did it, Dan." Social networks exploded. The hashtag #BrightFuturescum is trending. "Yes, I read it." Dan stood up, going to the window. "What are they saying?" "Everything you can," Nick chuckled. "Half of Denver is in shock. The other half is screaming that Laura was framed. But documents are a bomb. You can't challenge them. I just saw a post from some volunteer who confirms that something strange was going on at the foundation. And Laura, Mike, Dan squeezed the phone, imagining their faces. Laura is silent, but the fund has already issued a statement that it is conducting an internal review. Mike tweeted that it was slander and he would deal with those responsible. But Dan, this is just the beginning. Emily says the prosecutor's office is interested. Prosecutor's office. Dan felt everything shrinking inside. Already? Yeah, Nick lowered his voice. After the article, they couldn't stay away. If enough are found, it could become a criminal case. Okay, Dan exhaled, his resolve returning. Let them dig. But be prepared, Nick added. Laura and Mike will fight back. And they know you're behind it. Keep your head down until the storm passes. Got it, Dan said, although he knew there was no way to hide. Thank you, Nick. You're welcome, Nick hung up, leaving Dan in the silence of the room. He opened up social media and the hashtag #BrightFuturescum really dominated. Posts ranged from angry, how could she steal from children, to the defensive, Laura was framed, she's an angel. Someone even mentioned Dan, hinting that Dr. Harper's divorce had something to do with it. He closed the app, feeling the pressure build. At the hospital, Dan tried to concentrate, but news of the scandal penetrated there too. Colleagues whispered, patients cast curious glances. Caroline Wilson caught him in the staff room during a break. Dan, did you see the article? She asked, her eyes full of worry. Is this true? Did Laura really steal? Yes, Dan nodded, his voice quiet but firm. I found evidence. She and Mike. They used the fund as a personal account. Damn, Caroline shook her head. I knew she was with Mike, but this is a completely different level. I know, Dan looked away, feeling the pain returning. I just want the truth to come out. She's coming out, Caroline squeezed his shoulder. But hold on. People will say nasty things, especially now. Dan nodded, but her words could not soften the blow. By the end of the day, he learned that another patient had refused a consultation, and a colleague, Dr. Levy, was awkwardly avoiding him in the hallway. Rumors of his cruelty were now mixed with news of the scandal, and Dan felt himself a target. By noon, Nick sent a message. The foundation removed Laura from all projects. Mike lost 2 investors for his clubs. The prosecutor's office requested documents from the foundation. This is an explosion, Dan. Dan read it while sitting in the staff room, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a slight pang of satisfaction. Laura, who had built up the image of the Angel of Denver, was now under attack. Mike, whose empire of fitness clubs depended on his reputation, was losing everything he had built. But Dan knew they wouldn't give up without a fight. Emily Rose called late in the afternoon, her voice excited. Dan, did you see the reaction? She asked. The article received 100,000 views in a day. People are demanding an investigation. Yes, Nick said the prosecutor's office is already on the case, Dan answered, standing at the window of the room. The mountains behind the glass seemed closer than usual. This is just the beginning, Emily spoke quickly. I received a letter from another volunteer who was ready to talk. He knows about fake reports. If we confirm this, Laura and Mike won't get away with it. What do you need? Dan squeezed the phone. Time, she answered, and more evidence. Nick set new records. I'm checking them with a lawyer. But Dan, be careful. Mike already threatened you, and now they're panicking. I know, Dan remembered Mike's cold smile at the hospital. I won't stop. Okay, Emily paused. We're almost there. Hang in there. Dan turned off the call, feeling the adrenaline mixing with fatigue. The scandal was growing, and he was at the epicenter of it. Laura and Mike were losing everything, but he knew they would fight until the end. In the evening, Dan opened social networks, despite promising himself not to do so. The #BrightFuturescum hashtag was still trending, but now there were posts defending Laura. She's too pretty to steal. Mike was not silent either. His tweet read, Slander will not break me. We will find those responsible. Dan gritted his teeth, closing the app. They lied even when standing on the edge of the abyss. Dan Harper straightened his tie as he stood in front of his hotel room mirror. His reflection looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, stubble that he hadn't had time to shave, and a tense line to his mouth. Today was the first divorce hearing, and Dan felt his nerves stretch like strings. Emily Rose's article exposing Laura and Mike blew up Denver. Social networks were seething, Laura's foundation removed her from projects, and Mike's business was bursting at the seams. But Laura didn't give up. She continued to accuse Dan of emotional abuse, and rumors of his cruelty still tainted his reputation. The Rocky Mountains outside the window, illuminated by the morning sun, seemed distant, like hope for peace. Dan grabbed a folder of evidence, account statements, security footage, an insurance letter where Laura had named Mike as a beneficiary. His lawyer, Richard Klein, a short man with sharp eyes, insisted on presenting this evidence in court. "We will hit her with facts," he said. Dan knew that the truth was on his side, but public opinion, fueled by gossip, was like a shadow that could not be escaped. He left the hotel, got into his car, and drove to the courthouse in downtown Denver. Journalists were already crowding at the entrance. Their cameras and microphones resembled a flock of hungry birds. Dan lowered his head as he made his way through the crowd, ignoring the cries of, "Dr. Harper, is it true that you threatened your wife?" He clenched his teeth, feeling his anger boil. Laura had created this circus, and now he had to go through it. It was cold in the courtroom, despite the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The judge, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and stern eyes, sat at her desk, reviewing documents. Laura was already there, in a dark gray dress. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with determination. Next to her sat her lawyer, Miss Clara Hayes, a woman with sharp features and a confident posture. Dan took his place next to Richard, trying not to look at Laura. Her presence, just a few meters away, was like a knife in the chest. The judge tapped her gavel, calling for order. "We are trying a divorce case between Laura Harper and Daniel Harper," she began, her voice level. "Mrs. Harper, your lawyer claims that the reason for the divorce is irreconcilable differences and emotional abuse on the part of the husband. Please state your position." Clara Hayes stood up, adjusting her glasses. "Your Honor, my client, Laura Harper, suffered emotional neglect and abuse from Dr. Harper for 12 years of her marriage. He was obsessed with his career, ignored her needs, made her feel invisible. She repeatedly tried to establish dialogue, but Dr. Harper reacted with indifference or anger. We ask for a divorce and alimony, taking into account her contribution to the family and current financial difficulties." Dan clenched his fists under the table, his cheeks burning. Laura lied, rewriting their story, and her lawyer did it with such confidence that he almost believed he was guilty. But Richard put his hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Calm down, our move." The judge nodded, turning to Dan. "Dr. Harper, what is your position?" Richard stood up, his voice firm. "Your Honor, my client, Dr. Harper, categorically denies allegations of emotional abuse. On the contrary, he was a devoted husband who supported Mrs. Harper's career and her charitable projects. The reason for the divorce was not differences, but Mrs. Harper's infidelity, which lasted more than a year with Michael Stanton, a close friend of Dr. Harper. Moreover, we have evidence that Mrs. Harper and Mr. Stanton used her fund for personal expenses, which led to a public scandal and Mrs. Harper's removal from work." The hall fell silent. Only the whispers of journalists broke the silence. Laura looked down, her cheeks flushed, and Clara Hayes frowned, clearly not expecting such a turn. The judge raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharpening. "These are serious charges, Mr. Klein. Do you have proof?" "Yes, Your Honor." Richard opened the folder, laying out the documents. "Here are the account statements from the Bright Futures Fund, showing spending on hotels and restaurants not related to charity. Here is the CCTV footage confirming the presence of Mrs. Harper and Mr. Stanton in these areas. And here is a copy of the insurance policy in which Mrs. Harper 3 months ago made Mr. Stanton the beneficiary for $500,000, excluding her husband." Laura shuddered. Her lawyer quickly whispered something to her, but she did not answer. Dan looked at her, feeling a strange mixture of anger and pity. She looked lost, but he knew that didn't change her lie. Clara Hayes stood up, her voice sharp. Your Honor, these accusations have nothing to do with the case. My client is not required to explain his financial decisions, and alleged infidelity does not justify emotional abuse. We demand a focus on Dr. Harper's behavior. Miss Hayes, the judge raised her hand, stopping her. I understand your position, but evidence of infidelity and possible financial irregularities may affect the division of property and alimony. Mr. Klein, are you alleging that Mrs. Harper was involved in fraud? Yes, Your Honor, Richard nodded. These documents coincide with an investigation published by the Denver Chronicle. The prosecutor's office has already begun an investigation of the fund. The judge looked through the papers, her face unreadable. These are serious allegations, she said, but I need more facts to make a decision. Allegations of violence also require corroboration. I will adjourn the hearing for 2 weeks to allow both parties to provide further evidence. She tapped the gavel and the room began to disperse. Dan exhaled, feeling the tension release, but only for a moment. Richard turned to him, his gaze confident. We got them pinned down, Dan. Her accusations are weakening, especially with this scandal, but she will fight. I know, Dan nodded, his voice quiet. Thank you, Richard. Laura stood up. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she did not listen. Her gaze met Dan's, and a mixture of fear and anger flashed across it. She quickly turned away, leaving with Clara. Dan looked after her, feeling that the truth was on his side, but the pressure of public opinion still suffocated him. Outside the court, journalists pounced, their questions raining down like hail. Dr. Harper, are you taking revenge on your wife for cheating? Is it true that you threatened her? What can you say about the fund's machinations? Dan raised his hand, his voice firm. I said everything in court. My goal is the truth, and I believe it will come out. He pushed his way to the car, ignoring the cameras. A storm was raging inside him, relief that the judge had accepted his evidence, and anger that Laura was still lying. In the evening, Nick called. His voice was excited. Dan, you did great, he said. Emily says the trial worked in our favor. She found another witness, a fund accountant, who is willing to talk about fake reports. Is this it? Dan felt his pulse quicken. Enough for an article. Almost, Nick answered. Just a couple more days, and we will finish them off. But Dan, Laura, and Mike are panicking. Be careful. I know. Dan looked at the mountains outside the window. I'm ready. T-Dan's phone vibrated, but he ignored it, thinking it was another message from Nick or Caroline. Rumors of his cruelty subsided after the video proved Laura and Mike's affair, but the sympathy of his colleagues only emphasized his isolation. He lost everything: his wife, his friend, his home, and the truth, although it came out, could not fill the void. A knock on the door made him jump. Dan frowned, not expecting guests. He stood up, went to the door, and looked through the peephole. His heart froze. Laura. She stood in the hallway, wearing simple jeans and a gray sweater, her blonde hair disheveled and her face pale, without a trace of makeup. Dan clenched his jaw, feeling old wounds opening. He hasn't seen her since the first divorce hearing, where she lied and accused him of abuse. But now she was here, and he didn't know what to expect. He opened the door. His voice was cold. What do you need, Laura? She raised her eyes, full of tears, and her lips trembled. Dan, can I come in? Please. Dan hesitated, his instinct screaming to slam the door, but something in her appearance, fatigue, despair, stopped him. He stepped back, gesturing for her to come inside. Speak, he said, closing the door, but remaining against the wall, keeping his distance. Laura entered, her movements constrained. She stopped in the middle of the room, wrapping her arms around herself as if protecting herself. Her gaze slid around the room, the hard bed, the empty desk, the lone file of evidence, and returned to Dan. I know you hate me, she began, her voice shaking, and I don't blame you. But Dan, please, make it stop. All this investigation, articles, videos, this is destroying me. Dan looked at her, feeling his anger flare. destroys you. His voice was low, full of pain. You lied to me for a year, slept with Mike, stole money from a fund that was supposed to help children, and now you're asking me to stop. Laura sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I was stupid, Dan. I I didn't want it to turn out like this. It started by accident. Mike was. He was there when you weren't. I felt lonely, lost. Lonely? Dan stepped closer, his eyes burning. You could have told me, Laura. We could talk, decide. But you chose him. My friend. And you didn't just choose, you stole, lied, signed over the insurance to him. She shuddered, her tears flowing faster. I know it's my fault, she whispered. Insurance. It was a mistake. Mike convinced me, said that it was temporary, that he would help with the fund. I didn't think you'd find out. You didn't think I'd find out? Dan laughed bitterly, stepping back. Did you think I would live in your lies forever? Proud of you while you and Mike laugh at me. We didn't laugh. Laura raised her head. Her voice became louder. I loved you, Dan. I'm still, she trailed off, her shoulders slumping. I'm confused. Mike was. He understood me, but I didn't want to ruin our marriage. You destroyed it. Dan looked into her eyes. His voice was firm, but everything was breaking inside. You chose this path, Laura, not me. She stepped towards him, holding out her hand. Please, Dan, stop it. Say it was revenge, that you fabricated evidence. I will do everything so that we agree. We can start over. I'll leave the foundation. I'll leave Denver. Dan recoiled, her words like a blow. Start again? He shook his head, his voice trembling. Do you think I can forget what you did? You lied to me, to the city, to everyone. You stole from the children, Laura, and now you want me to lie for you. I didn't want to steal. She almost screamed. Her face was wet with tears. I thought we were doing good. Mike said it's normal that everyone does this. I trusted him, and this is your excuse. Dan clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream. You trusted him, not me. You chose him, Laura, and now you are reaping the consequences. She sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking. I lost everything, she whispered. Foundation, reputation, friends. They hate me, Dan. I can't go outside without feeling stares. You did it yourself, he said. His voice was cold, but inside he felt a pang of pity. Laura, whom he loved, was broken, but he could not forgive. You and Mike thought you wouldn't get caught. But the truth always comes out. Laura raised her eyes, anger flashing in them. You're enjoying this, right? You ruined my life, and you love it. Am I enjoying it? Dan stepped towards her, his voice trembling with pain. You ruined my life, Laura. My marriage, my faith in people. You and Mike lied to me every day, and now you dare accuse me. She was silent, her tears dripping onto the floor. Dan turned away, looking at the mountains outside the window. He felt their marriage dying in this room, completely and irrevocably. Go away, he said quietly, without turning around. We have nothing more to say. Laura stood up. Her movements were slow, as if she was carrying an invisible weight. She stopped at the door, her voice barely audible. I didn't want it to end like this, Dan. But it's over, he answered, still looking out the window. Goodbye, Laura. She left, quietly closing the door. Dan stood listening to her footsteps fade down the corridor. He felt something inside him breaking, the last thread connecting him to their past. Their marriage was dead, and this conversation became its funeral. Dan sat down on the bed, his hands shaking. He opened the folder with the evidence, but did not look. He already knew every line by heart. He dialed Nick instead, his voice tired. Nick, Laura was here, he said. I asked you to stop the investigation. She admitted that Mike got her involved in the scam. Damn, Nick paused. She's trying to save her skin. What did you say? I refused. Dan squeezed the phone. She chose it herself. That's right, Nick spoke firmly. Emily is preparing a new article. We have the accountant's testimony. The prosecutor's office is almost ready to file charges. They won't get out. Okay, Dan exhaled. Keep me posted. In the morning, Dan arrived at the courthouse, where the final divorce hearing was to take place. The journalists who had besieged the entrance last time were now busy with the criminal case of Laura and Mike, and Dan walked inside almost unnoticed. The courtroom was just as cold as the first time, but the atmosphere had changed. The judge, Mrs. Elizabeth Grant, sat at her desk, her gaze stern but calm. Dan took a seat next to his lawyer, Richard Klein, whose confidence gave him strength. Laura entered. Her steps were slow, almost hesitant. She was dressed in a simple black suit. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her face was pale, without a trace of the charisma that had once charmed everyone. Her lawyer, Clara Hayes, looked tense. Her folder of documents seemed thinner than at the last hearing. Laura didn't look at Dan. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, and he realized that she was broken. The judge tapped her gavel, calling for order. We continue to consider the divorce case between Laura Harper and Daniel Harper, she began. At the last hearing, evidence was presented of Mrs. Harper's infidelity and her possible involvement in financial irregularities. Miss Hayes, what is your position? Clara stood up, her voice less confident than before. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that there were problems in the marriage, but insists that emotional neglect by Dr. Harper contributed to her decisions. We are asking for a fair division of property and alimony given her current unemployment. Dan clenched his fists, but Richard whispered, We're ready. He stood up, his tone firm. Your Honor, Mrs. Harper's allegations of emotional abuse are not supported by any facts. Instead, we proved her year-long infidelity with Michael Stanton and her involvement in the Bright Futures fraud. Mrs. Harper was fired for loss of confidence and prosecutors filed criminal charges against her. We are asking that the marriage be dissolved, that the house be left to Dr. Harper as the primary owner, and that alimony be denied based on her actions. The judge nodded, looking through the documents. I have read the materials, she said. The evidence of Mrs. Harper's infidelity is compelling, and her involvement in financial impropriety undermines her request for alimony. Mr. Klein, did you mention the criminal case? Yes, Your Honor, Richard handed over newspapers. Prosecutors accuse Mrs. Harper and Mr. Stanton of fraud and embezzlement. This confirms our arguments about her dishonesty. Clara tried to object, but her voice was weak. Your Honor, the criminal case has not yet been considered, and my client has the right to the presumption of innocence. That's true, the judge agreed. But current circumstances, including Mrs. Harper's suspension and public evidence of her actions, are influencing the decision. I give my verdict. The marriage is dissolved. The house remains with Dr. Harper as the primary owner. Alimony is not assigned. Laura shuddered. Her lawyer whispered something, but she did not answer. Dan looked at her, feeling strangely empty. He won, but the victory was bitter. The judge tapped her gavel, and the courtroom began to empty. Laura stood up. Her movements were mechanical, and she walked away without looking at Dan. He remained seated until Richard tapped him on the shoulder. We did it, Dan, he said. You are free. Thank you, Richard, Dan nodded, but his voice was devoid of joy. Freedom was cold, like the mountain air outside the window. In the evening, Dan returned to the hotel, feeling tired. Nick called, his voice full of enthusiasm. Dan, did you hear? Mike sold his 2 clubs and left Denver. They say he's in California, trying to save what's left of his business. And Laura? Dan stood at the window, looking at the mountains. Fired from all projects, Nick answered. The prosecutor's office is preparing charges. Her reputation is dead, Dan. We got them. Yes, Dan exhaled, but his heart was heavy. Thank you, Nick. I couldn't have done it without you. Dan Harper stood at the window of his new office, looking out over the Rocky Mountains, whose snow-capped peaks shone in the spring sun. Behind the glass, Denver was bustling with life. Cars honked their horns, passers-by hurried along the sidewalks, and the city seemed to have forgotten about the scandal that was tearing up the headlines just 3 months ago. Laura and Mike, whose names were once synonymous with success, were now just an echo of the past. Laura was awaiting trial on fraud charges, and Mike, having sold the remains of his business, disappeared somewhere in California. Dan won the battle, but the victory left him with a void that he was only now beginning to fill. He turned, looking around his office, a modest space with white walls, a few medical posters, and a wooden desk littered with papers. This was his new free heart clinic for the poor, opened with money from the sale of his and Laura's home. The decision to sell the house came shortly after the final divorce hearing, when Dan realized that he could not return to a place saturated with lies. He chose a small apartment in the city center and invested the rest in a clinic, calling it Heart Haven. The name was symbolic. He wanted to give people not only health, but also hope, which he himself so lacked. Dan put on his white coat in preparation for his first patient. His clinic, opened just a month ago, was already attracting people: the homeless, workers, the elderly, those who couldn't afford insurance. He worked here 3 days a week, combining it with his main practice at the hospital, and every day he felt something come to life inside him. His patients thanked him with such sincerity that he began to believe that his life still had meaning. The first patient was Mr. Rodriguez, a 62-year-old bus driver with hypertension. He entered, leaning on a cane. His face was haggard, but his eyes were alive. "Dr. Harper, I've heard about you," he said, sitting down. "They say you help people like me for free. This is true?" "True," Dan smiled, opening his card. "Tell me how you feel." "My heart is beating," Rodriguez shrugged, "but I'm not complaining. Life isn't easy enough, you know?" "I know," Dan nodded, checking his blood pressure, "but we'll figure it out. Let's start with a new drug and diet. Can you come once a month? If you don't mind an old man who talks a lot," Rodriguez chuckled. "I don't mind chatter," Dan laughed, and for the first time in months, the laughter was sincere. After Rodriguez came others: a single mother with arrhythmia, a teenager with a suspected heart defect, a pensioner afraid of surgery. Dan listened, examined, prescribed treatment, and with each patient he felt his own heart become lighter. Working in the clinic was not just a duty, it was salvation, a bridge to a new meaning in life. At lunchtime, Dan received a call from Nick Torres, who was now more of a friend than just a detective. "Dan, how is your clinic?" Nick asked, his voice cheerful. "I heard you're a star there." "I'm trying," Dan smiled, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. "There are enough patients. What do you have?" "Everything is quiet," Nick answered. "Laura is under house arrest, awaiting trial. Mike is said to be in Los Angeles, but his clubs are still sinking. The scandal has died down, but people are still discussing it. By the way, you're in the news." "On the news?" Dan frowned. "For what?" "Emily wrote an article about your clinic," Nick chuckled. "Called you the man who turned betrayal into hope. Now everyone wants an interview." "Damn," Dan shook his head. "I don't want to be a hero, Nick. I just do what I have to do." "And you are the hero," Nick said seriously. "You went through hell and didn't break." "It inspires people, Dan. They see that they can fight for the truth and win." "Maybe," Dan looked away, looking at the mountains. "But I don't feel like a winner yet." "Give me time," Nick paused, "and come for a beer when you've sorted out the hearts." "Agreed," Dan smiled and turned off the call. He opened Emily's article on the Denver Chronicle website. It was shorter than her expose on Laura and Mike, but heartwarming. Dr. Daniel Harper, who survived betrayal and public scandal, opened a free clinic to give the underprivileged a second chance. His story is a reminder that truth and kindness can heal. Dan closed the tab, feeling a slight warmth in his chest. He wasn't looking for fame, but he knew his clinic was already changing lives. By evening, Dan had finished his appointment, but remained in the office, reviewing grant applications for the clinic. His team, 2 volunteers and a hospital nurse, worked with enthusiasm, and he saw their efforts bear fruit. But when the office lights went out and he was left alone, the loneliness returned. He didn't even tell Caroline, who had become his support system in the hospital, about it, but the nights were the hardest. Without Laura, without their home, without a past, he felt like a ship without an anchor. Dan went to the window, looking at the mountains. He remembered his and Laura's trip to Aspen, their laughter on the ski slope, her hand in his. Then he thought that their love was eternal. Now he knew that nothing lasts forever, but this did not mean the end. The clinic, the patients, their grateful glances, this was his new beginning. He remained alone, but for the first time in months, he began to look forward to the future with hope. He remembered Mr. Rodriguez, who said today, "You gave me a chance, doctor. Maybe I'll run again." Dan smiled, feeling something inside come to life. He was not ready for new love, he was not ready to trust, but he was ready to live. The scandal has subsided, but his story remains. In Denver, they spoke of him not as a victim, but as a man who got up and moved on. His clinic became a symbol. If Dan Harper could survive betrayal and find meaning, then others could fight for the truth. Dan turned off the light and left the office, locking the door. A sign at the entrance read, "Heart Haven, Free Heart Clinic." He ran his fingers over the letters, feeling their hardness. The wind moved his hair, and he took a deep breath, feeling free. The Rockies looked at him like old friends, and Dan knew he was ready for a new chapter. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.